pleasure to be here. So we have some very big topics to discuss today, so I'll get right into it. And first, give you a little bit of an introduction. In the past decade, movements for climate justice have proliferated and have gained visibility in massive protests, strategically focused direct actions, and other things. Yet the world continues on this death march to catastrophic climate change. We're already experiencing the symptoms of that in extreme weather, polar ice melt, methane discharge from thawing tundra, decreases in biodiversity, and so on. Now, obstructing the changes needed to salvage human communities is the power of capital, wielded at different scales and in different contexts. And in these seminars, we try to situate climate struggles in the broad context of transnational class formation and the political economy of fossil capital. So let me begin with this question of class formation, taking a bit of a Gramscian perspective on it. So the framework that I want to briefly lay out views class formation as a complex process in which historical blocks are brought into being. And this involves both a structural process tied to modes of production and their reproduction, and an agency-centered process involving class struggle and collective action. And in searching for an adequate account of the dialectical play of agency and structure in class formation, I've turned to Alf Nielsen's Marxist theory of social movements. So he says social movements emanate from and are grounded in the collective skilled activity of both dominant and subaltern groups. A movement from above strives to maintain or modify a dominant structure in ways that reproduce or extend the power of dominant groups and their hegemonic position within the social formation. So that's a movement from above. A movement from below pursues an alternative project of reform or transformation. And when we think of this in terms of agency, class formation therefore involves the formation of movements from above and below. And of course, their interaction. And in these movement-forming processes, this is where we find a structurally defined class in itself becoming a class for itself, capable of articulating and pursuing its collective interests. So the struggle between replicating the past, maintaining business as usual, and opening alternative futures is at the center of class formation. That's the way I want to look at this. And of course, class struggle. Within the climate emergency, class formation from above involves the protection of capital, the protection of revenue streams, the delay of changes that might threaten profits, and the assimilation of mitigating technologies or post-carbon technologies into capital and capital accumulation. In these circumstances, class formation from below must embrace the struggle for a post-capitalist, post-carbon way of life. So the way I look at this, contemporary movements for climate justice really are at the cutting edge of this struggle. Now, in my own studies of class formation, I've leaned on Gramsci's account of hegemony and counter-hegemony and the role of intellectuals in all of that. In this perspective, each fundamental group or class creates, as part of its own being, organic intellectuals, organizers of a way of life, who provide leadership in economic, political, cultural contexts. This leadership is crucial to the functioning of institutions, but also to the conduct of social movements from above and below. Just as dominant organizations construct hegemonic projects with and for the ruling class, movements from below inhabit and help sustain what are called subaltern counterpublics, where members of subordinated social groups invent and circulate counter-discourses, alternative perspectives on the world, which enable them to interpret their identities and interests and needs and strategize. Now, what makes class formation transnational are the practices that cut across national borders. Networked across national spaces and issue domains, such practices vivify what we call historical blocks. For transnational neoliberalism on one side, class formation from above, and democratic globalization on the other side. And of course, this contrast is nicely captured in the comparison of the World Economic Forum and the World Social Forum, right? We think about these as points of condensation for complex networks and transnational historical blocks. The struggle to form such blocks, and in the process either to replicate the dominant structures or to transform them, this is what I mean by transnational class formation. So thinking about this contrast between the World Economic Forum and the World Social Forum reminds us of how sloped the playing field is, how sloped it is to capital's advantage. I mean, after all, think about it. The World Economic Forum is an ongoing global project, well-funded, well-connected into powerful institutions, right? Corporate, state institutions. It commands attention. Even a right-wing populist bull in the neoliberal China shop cannot really disturb the hegemony of this. Or perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps he can't be accommodated, but as you can see, looks like he's fitting in some ways. The World Social Forum, on the other hand, is permanently precarious and fledgling, beset with dilemmas, easily dismissed and marginalized. And in the past 2 decades, my own research program has focused on both sides of these complex processes, and increasingly on fossil capital and climate justice struggles as focal issues. Now, as this example, World Social Forum, World Economic Forum shows, capital holds the strong suit in transnational class formation. Most obviously in its controlled economic resources, including labor and thus our common future, and in its multifaceted but largely convivial relations with state power. Class formation from below, on the other hand, is fraught. Subaltern consciousness is contradictory, fragmented. Subaltern struggles, founded initially through militant particularism, protest, and resistance in a specific place, are framed around singular issues and identities. And this difficult project of finding common ground, connecting the dots between different forms of opposition, that may on the surface and in the immediate situation seem quite different and disparate and even at odds with each other, is part of this process of class formation from below. If, as Marx wrote in the Grundrisse, capital is the economic power that dominates everything in bourgeois society, which I think is a great definition of capital, how against this ubiquitous power can such disparate strata make common cause without reproducing other injustices? And the challenges multiply as we move to the level of transnational class formation from below. And here again, the World Social Forum is an instructive case. It was founded as an open space, right, for discussion of important issues, bringing different movements together. And it's had difficulty moving beyond that open space conceptualization. It's faced the dilemma of remaining an open space, a talking shop, or transforming itself into something resembling a party. Very difficult to make that transition from talk to action. And as it's experienced these difficulties, its relevance as a center of historical formation has perhaps weakened. The World Social Forum's loss of momentum is symptomatic of the left's failure to articulate a post-carbon alternative to neoliberalism, particularly after the financial meltdown of 2008. Indeed, Donald Trump and Trumpism, if you like, and related developments in authoritarian populism are a reaction to neoliberalism's success in opening markets around the world. This is what it looks like, which is only a failure when judged against human need. not a failure in terms of capital and its self-expansion. Walter Benjamin's observation that every rise of fascism bears witness to a failed revolution speaks precisely to our current condition. Yet the phenomenon of Trump also shows that capitalism faces serious challenges to its global governance regime, as neoliberal ultra-imperialism meets intensifying inter-imperialist rivalry. And behind all this lie neoliberalism's continuing crisis, including the instability of financialized capitalism. And last but not least, the climate crisis itself. So we'll return to class formation from below and climate justice struggles tomorrow and in our final seminar. But for now, for this session, we're going to focus more on class formation from above and fossil capital. Now, the view from above identifies class formation with the expanding transnational scope and reach of corporate power in various ways. So what is corporate power? Well, corporate power is the power that accrues to great concentrations of capital, large corporations. And as capital concentrates, so does this power. Structurally, corporate power amounts to the control of capital, but not only corporations, but of capital flows, right, of finance. In terms of agency, those wielding this power make the top-level decisions in corporations. Increasingly, this power has been projected beyond national states in complex networks of corporations, capital markets, policy planning groups, World Economic Forum, quasi-state institutions, forming a transnational historical bloc. Now, atop each corporate giant, whether industrial or financial, sits a board of directors, right? And that's the center of power and authority. And it's made up of both capitalists and their advisors, right? Organic intellectuals who serve basically in advisory capacity. The multiple affiliations of directors generate a network of interlocking directors. They sit on each other's boards, right? And we can actually map that out. But what we're talking about here is a corporate elite, drawing the leading lights of capitalism into a network, a small world. And this corporate elite, in our view, is the leading edge of the capitalist class. So it's a key force in class formation from above. Now, unpacking things a bit further in terms of corporate power, really corporate power involves three basic economic modalities. We can talk about operational power, strategic power, and allocative power. Operational power reaches from the executive suite all the way down to the shop floor. It's the power of management, right? It's the power that workers directly experience. Strategic power is the power to control capital, to control the corporation itself, to set the business strategies of the company. And allocative power is the control of credit. It's the control of money upon which large corporations, and for that matter, states, depend. Reaching into the extra economic domain, organic intellectuals play important political leadership roles and roles in policy planning. So my own research has mapped the contours of the transnational elite network, focusing on the last decade of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century. And what I found in this particular book, The Making of the Transnational Capitalist Class, is that the corporate power network, the global network, is highly regionalized, overwhelmingly a Euro-North American configuration. This shows the enduring influence of the North Atlantic ruling class, which has long been at the center of global corporate power. You can see in this bar graph that the vast majority of the people who are interlocutors, the people who connect across different corporate boards of directors, are based in Europe, and they're largely connecting within Europe, within the countries of Europe, within North America, and across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the global corporate network is a hierarchy constituted through selective participation of firms and directors in the cities and countries they call home. For the most part, the network strings together directors of corporations based in major urban centers of Northwest Europe and Northeast North America, with London, Paris, and New York enjoying pride of place. And this is the way the interurban network actually looks. When you sort of aggregate it to the level of cities, the corporate boards connect across different cities, with New York being a central hub, obviously, London being another central hub, it's in here somewhere, Paris being a central hub on the continent of Europe. In this view of the, this confirms the enduring influence of the North Atlantic ruling class, which has long been at the center of corporate power, as I mentioned. Even so, as capital accumulation has become more transnational, the locus of corporate command centers has become more dispersed to include within the network the smaller states of Europe, more of the global south, and a greater range of global cities. So if we compare 1996, this is the international network at 1996. So these lines indicate how thick they are indicates how many corporate interlocks occur between corporations based in the United States and the UK in the case of this line. So in 1996, you can see virtually everything is Euro North America. Australia is weakly in there, and so is Kuwait. Otherwise, it's all Euro North America, except for Japan. A decade later, the network has broadened. There's more countries participating, that is, more corporations based in these countries participating in the network. But most of the traffic continues to be within Europe or across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I want to turn to the issue of class hegemony, which is crucial politically and culturally in our understanding of class formation. When we examine the global corporate elite's reach beyond the economic into the cultural and the political realms, an important site on which the hegemonic project of neoliberal globalization has been assembled and promoted is the Transnational Policy Group. And we're talking about groups like the Trilateral Commission or the World Economic Forum, World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and so on. JP and I have analyzed this network in some depth, and we find that these groups are intimately tied to the world's largest corporations through interlocking governance boards. So people sitting on the World Business Council for Sustainable Development's board also sit on the boards of major banks and industrial corporations of the world. Not surprising, but we can map it out. And what we find is a highly centralized transnational network that's a corporate policy group network. A few dozen extensively networked corporate directors serve as organic intellectuals in this network for an incipient transnational capitalist class. That's our reading of it anyway. Certain organizations like the Trilateral Commission and World Business Council for Sustainable Development play especially central roles. Now, in this view of the network, what we're looking at is the inner circle of the corporate policy elite, circa 2006. So these people are sitting on multiple corporate boards. They're also sitting on multiple policy boards. And so what they create is a very centralized small world of corporate economic and political power. In political power, not in the sense that they're controlling a state apparatus, but in the sense that they're involved in the production of a hegemonic project, right? Neoliberal globalization, as to put it into kind of a shorthand. The policy boards reproduce a north-south unevenness in participation. Because what they do is they draw together North American and European corporate elites much more closely than the elites based elsewhere. So they reinforce that kind of north-south bias, if you like, in the structure of transnational corporate power. And they also differ among themselves in terms of specifically what they're about. So the World Business Council for Sustainable Development has a different project from the trilateralist project of the Trilateral Commission. but the two are compatible. So we have a kind of rich organizational ecology here that generates different compatible discourses in which the various transnational policy initiatives can take root. Over time, the policy groups have proliferated and become more integrated in the global corporate power structure as national corporate networks have thinned. So we get the national networks sort of not falling apart, but becoming a bit thinner as the transnational corporate network thickens. And that's indicative of this process of transnational capitalist class formation. This has given the trilateral, this has given the transnational capitalist class increased capacity to act as a class for itself through the policy groups like the World Economic Forum. So to conclude the first piece of our presentation, what I want to emphasize is how the architecture of corporate power offers support for a qualified version of the transnational capitalist class thesis, that there is a transnational capitalist class and it really matters in global politics today. Overall, there's been some decline in national corporate communities and a shift toward transnational corporate elite. Yet most corporate networkers remain national, as we saw in that bar graph I showed you. And most transnationalists are primarily attached to one national network. So we have, South Africa no doubt has its own corporate network, right, as a national corporate network. But it's also, if we look at it carefully, we can probably find certain linkages into the global formation. And so that's what we're looking at, a formation that exists at both national and transnational levels. Other evidence of transnational capitalist class formation lie in the elaboration of an elite corporate policy network, as I've mentioned, which is part of a transnational historical bloc, enabling transnational capital to find a kind of voice politically for itself. And that voice, we can hear that voice when we listen to what is said at the World Economic Forum, for example. But the transnational capitalist class is itself, as I say, embedded in national business communities. And finally, the process of transnational capitalist class formation is not homogeneous, it's actually rather regionalized. The strongest tendencies have been within Europe. The formation of corporate Europe is what really stands out when you look at the overall global network of the transnational capitalist class. But the formation of corporate Europe cannot be read simply as transnationalization in the abstract. It is foremost a project of regional integration of the different capitalist classes of Europe, right? And it's fraught with its own internal contradictions. Finally, north-south disparities register very strongly. As of 2006 at least, the largest banks of the world, for example, were virtually all located within the triangle, that is within Europe, North America, and Japan. Just a tiny handful of southern-based capitalists participated in the transnational network at all. So at this point, what I want to do is just pause and see what kinds of questions and comments, discussion we can get going in the next few minutes, and then I'll move on to the second part of our presentation. So who has any kind of question or comment on what I've said so far? Yes?
Now just on that last bit, that is the picture at the moment. But there's changed from 96, 2006, and 2018, I presume it's shifted even slightly more. However, what is the prognosis in your view, say in 10 to 20 years' time? How central, or to what extent will China alter this picture?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that
And
question.
India to some extent.
What's that?
And India to some extent.
And India to some extent, but particularly China. Because China stands out above all else in terms of the so-called BRICS, which I think is a chaotic category actually. But China is indeed changing its position in vis-a-vis the transnational capitalist class. And tomorrow I'm going to present some findings that I've just been developing the last couple of weeks, actually, looking at the network in 2018, comparing to 2006. And the difference that really stands out is China and its dramatically increased prominence in the global network. So that's indeed what's happening. It's sort of hard to project it out further, but certainly that's the momentum that's going on at this point.
Why don't we take a couple questions at a time?
Yeah, could do. Okay, so we'll collect a couple of questions at a time.
Three?
3 questions. Go ahead.
Just related to China as well, with the imminent or possibility of a trade war between the US and China, do you think that that would provide the opportunity for African business and African transnational potential to come to the fore, even within our own continent?
Okay. And who else has a question?
There's just 2 issues. One is to unscramble this notion of neoliberal ultra-imperialism. And it evokes for me this idea of Kautsky and sort of the harmony between kind of global capital and capitalists. So it'd be interesting to hear more about what you're getting at. I mean, is this the underpinnings of that kind of conception, where this network really brings it all together? So that's the first point. The second point is, so if capital in a national space, in the peripheries of capitalism, are not articulated and participating in this transnational class and process, what are they? So are they still monopoly capital? Are they state capital? I mean, how would we think about that? So clearly it's not all displaced. In the centers, there seems to be a kind of displacement going on vis-a-vis monopoly capital. But in the peripheries, like South Africa, so it didn't feature on that map, but we've got a highly monopolized political economy. So some views on that.
Okay. So the question of national monopoly capital in particular is what you were talking about? Yeah.
Can I piggyback on that? I don't think I understand what transnational capitalist class is. I thought I knew, but now I think I don't know. And I think and I loved it. It's fantastic. But exactly as Vish was saying, if we see that most corporate classes are still nationally based, you said, then what makes them transnational? What makes it Is it the policy and interests? Is it this kind of supra-economic stuff that makes them transnational, but yet they remain a national class? Or, so I guess I'm confused about that. And it's not really the rise of China, but is the rise of finance changing the game?
Okay, let me try to answer these questions. In terms of the incipient trade war between the United States and China, whether that provides openings for African-based capital, I don't really have an answer to your question. I mean, it's hard to see how that necessarily would be an implication of the trade war. I mean, if the trade war comes into full bloom, I guess what we would be looking at is a destabilization of the transnational neoliberal regime. Maybe that opens possibilities for countries to think about delinking from global capitalism, and perhaps countries in Africa, and movements from below could push for such a delinking and a kind of democratization process in terms of the economy. But it's hard. I'm really speculating. I'm really not sure what the implications are of that. In terms of neoliberal ultra-imperialism, that's sort of my neologism. I don't know. Maybe someone else has used it. But yes, what I'm getting at that with that conception is very much what we're finding in our research in terms of, the one big happy capitalist family that's come together transnationally, and we have this project of opening borders and creating the free flow of friction-free capitalism, as Bill Gates once called it. And that's been the hegemonic project for some time. But I think in terms of the trade war, as an example, Donald Trump and some of the other tensions are beginning to destabilize that. And of course, the economic crisis of 2008, which the global capitalist system is still not really recovered from. It's still sort of limping along, I would say. Of course, there are different rates of accumulation in different countries and so on. But I think I'm suggesting that there's some indications of increased inter-imperialist rivalry, breaking that kind of neoliberal consensus that really this research from the late 90s into the early 21st century tends to show. In terms of national monopoly capital versus transnational, and similarly Michelle's question, what is it? What is the transnational capitalist class? I think it's a very good question, and I think my point is that it's not that easy to actually categorize people as, well, okay, this person is a transnational capitalist, but this person is a national capitalist. In some cases, you can definitely make that division, but a lot of capitalists who are active transnationally still have a national kind of base to their capital accumulation. But at the same time, some of these hegemonic policy groups, like the World Economic Forum, really do have a commitment to building a transnational capitalist regime. So in terms of policy, I think we can see some of that coming into existence in the most recent decades and continuing into our current conjuncture. But I think, finance is a very interesting question because if you look at what I'll show you tomorrow, some of the network analysis from 2018, it's the Chinese banks, which are now the largest banks in the world, which have actually entered the global network. So maybe that's all I'll say for now because we're sort of stacked up here with other pieces of the presentation that we want to get to. I don't want to steal time from JP, for example. So I realize I haven't really done justice to your questions, but I think what I'll do at this point is move on to the second part of the presentation and then take another series of questions, if that's okay with everybody. So that was our discussion. And the second part of my part of the presentation is around political ecology and political economy of fossil capital. But here we're getting more specific, right? So turning to this question of climate crisis and fossil capital, let me begin with the obvious. The symptoms of climate crisis are abundant, whether we're in Johannesburg or where I'm from, Victoria, Canada. We're all familiar with the hockey stick graph, right? That plots the global mean temperature over the most recent millennium, showing exponential increase in temperature with the Industrial Revolution. Now, just a few dozen carbon majors. This is a graph that shows us the global CO2 emissions overall, and underneath it, the total carbon majors. These are 90 companies, for the most part corporations and their predecessor companies that Richard Eady has meticulously tracked way back to the 19th century. You can see that almost all of the total carbon emissions are actually emitted by 90 corporate entities, okay? And these are companies like Royal Dutch Shell, BP. The climate crisis is the most urgent aspect of an even wider ecological crisis, as we know. As we witness the extinction and the ongoing depletion of so-called resources, leading to extreme extractivism, as capital's ecological overshoot continues unabated. The crisis thus has a dual character. It's an economic crisis, cyclical, boom bust, right? Capitalist economic crisis, but it's also an ecological crisis. And these have different dynamics. The economic crisis is cyclical, barring an exit from capitalism itself, which would be nice, in my view. Ecological crisis, on the other hand, names the cumulative degeneration of the Earth's living systems. It's not a cyclical crisis at all. And in approaching this issue, we need to combine insights from two critical perspectives. So, of course, these are political ecology, political economy, as I've mentioned. We need to ask how capital gains its power by appropriating energy flows, while also interrogating the future. How can we transition from fossil capitalism to a democratic and ecologically sane alternative? And from Marx's classic analysis, we can garner four foundational insights, if you like. First one is about class struggle, that the interests of capital in appropriating new wealth as profit are opposed to the interests of labor in living well and in expressing human creativity. And this is the class struggle, very broadly, in broad terms. Intercapitalist competition is another fundamental dynamic of capitalism. Capital exists in many units. It's never fully unified. It's competing for shares of the surplus generated by living labor. And so intercapitalist competition presses each capitalist to reduce costs, plow back profits into expanded operations, to stay in the game. Otherwise they fall behind, they get taken over, they go bankrupt, whatever. And microeconomically, this means that capital must grow or die. If firms don't keep up with the competition, they're going to die. Systemically, it means that capitalism is continuously expanding, commodifying and creating new markets and new products. And then finally, there's a fourth foundational insight, if you like, metabolic rift. As it expands, as it colonizes and urbanizes the world, capital creates a metabolic rift between humanity, which is organized by capital, and the rest of nature. And that's what we're up against in the climate crisis, the playing out of this metabolic rift, very dramatically. Recent work combining political ecology and economy has built on these insights. So what I want to do is just walk us through what I take to be four key texts that have come out in the last few years. So the first one is Fossil Capital, a book by Andreas Malm. And in this book, what Malm shows is how the development of capitalism as the globally dominant way of life rested on carbon energy, which has been especially suited to capital in the class struggle and useful to it in that struggle as something that could be easily commodified and transported, mobile. You can sort of use the coal or oil in any particular place to power whatever you're trying to power, from the Industrial Revolution forward. So fossil capital empowers capital to accumulate on an extended scale by burning all this buried sunshine, right? But in burning that buried sunshine, that's the result of many years of life, it releases carbon dioxide on the same extended scale, leading inevitably to climate crisis. This is Andreas Malm's key insight. Now, Timothy Mitchell, a few years ago, published a book called Carbon Democracy, which notes, ironically, that from the 1870s on, the age of democracy coincided with the age of empire. So democracy and empire have a lot to do with each other. He says, quote, the rise of coal produced democracy at some sites and colonial domination at others. At the core of the world system, coal mining brought workers together at key points in the commodity chain, enhancing their power and enabling the northern working class to demand concessions that led to capitalist democracy, that is to say, carbon democracy. With the shift from coal to oil, much of the resource was in the Middle East, where colonial power and ethnic divisions advantaged capital. Oil production required fewer workers and very capital intensive, and provided fewer opportunities to disrupt smooth accumulation. So from Standard Oil right through OPEC, monopoly power has enabled a few players to manage supply to ensure a steady stream of profits. This is the way the oil industry works. The oil industry is absolutely central to global capitalism. The third key text is this very astute case study of the United States as the epicenter of this way of life, of carbon capitalism, of carbon democracy. And this is a book by Matthew Huber, which explores how the hegemony of carbon capital was cemented in the post-World War II era with the rise of suburbanized consumerism. In consumer capitalism's golden years, Matthew Huber notes that cars and single detached houses and appliances energized, it's a very useful term, all of this stuff, these gadgets and everything, suburbanization, it energized segments of the working class, particularly in the United States, and Canada to a great extent has the same story really, affording what he says is enormous power over machines, space, and everyday life in navigating the practices of reproduction. And so working class people themselves participating in this way of life gained a privatized form of power, agency, as petroleum products came to saturate their everyday worlds. Within this assemblage, the individual experiences automobility as empowering and liberating. Of course, it's also individualizing, right? And commodifying. The individual experiences this sense of empowerment. Similarly, the single detached house is experienced as a domain of personal sovereignty. Now, Matthew Huber points out that the long-range result of all this has been to constrain politics within narrow limits. He says, focused on the family, private property, and anti-collectivist sentiments, which become the stock and trade of neoliberalism. So it's an interesting analysis because he's pointing to an era in which the Keynesian welfare state, the class compromise, was all solidified in the 50s and 60s in the United States. And yet in that very same era, the cultural and psychological foundations for neoliberal entrepreneurialism, for the individual as entrepreneur, really take shape within this suburbanization scenario, this scenario of oil as our lifeblood, right? As what empowers us to be individuals. And even if for most people the American dream is a hoax, it continues to carry heavy affective and ideological ballast, giving the suburban consumer a stake in the endless growth of carbon-driven consumer capitalism and posing an ideological barrier, particularly in the global north, but even here, to movements for climate justice. Okay, so I said there's 4 of these key texts, and I'm being arbitrary, there's all sorts of great literature in this field, but I think these are 4 fairly important books. So the 4th one is by Jason Moore, Capitalism in the Way of Life. And Jason Moore observes that capital has always boosted its profitability by appropriating what he calls cheap nature. So for capital, nature has served as both a tap and a sink, right? From sugarcane in 19th century Natal to coal mine in the Eka deposits of contemporary South Africa, business has tapped nature's bounty. At the same time, nature has been a sink, absorbing the waste, right, from capitalist production. So it's tapping the resources, commodifying them, especially carbon in this instance of fossil capital, and it's also nature providing the sink, like the atmosphere is part of that sink, right? So are the forests that absorb carbon dioxide. And when capital claimed only a small part of the planet, these ecologically destructive tendencies were only had local consequences. But with the full-fledged globalization in the late 20th century, with the real scaling up of capital to planetary scale, and the closing of resource frontiers, the sink overflows. with greenhouse gases. That's where we are. And other pollutants. And the tap begins to run dry, not only in declining agricultural productivity, that is cheap food, but in depletion of high-grade oil. And this depletion of high-grade oil provokes resort to extreme carbon, carrying greater emissions. Like I'm from Canada, we've got our tar sands, one of the worst abominations, right, in terms of fossil capital in the world today. And the treadmill of production spins out of control. Although fossil capital spent many years orchestrating a climate denial campaign, while its own scientists documented the link between carbon emissions and global warming, industry and its enablers and allies have more recently, and with some reluctance, embraced climate capitalism, which JP is going to talk about in a few minutes. But to help set this up, let me say this. Within this framework, solutions to the climate crisis comprise new green accumulation strategies that seem to address the climate crisis, but are unequal to the challenge. These false solutions comprise a repertoire of new denialism. In this new denialism, the fossil fuel industry and our political leaders assure us that they understand and accept the scientific warnings about climate change, but they are in denial about what this scientific reality really means for policy, and they continue to block progress in less visible ways. Now, integral to climate capitalism and new denialism, integral to climate capitalism, new denialism involves talking one way and walking the other way, which is Patrick Bond's favorite expression, and it's absolutely appropriate. By obstructing the kinds of changes that could decarbonize our ecological footprint in a timely manner, but that also threaten corporate profits and control of economic decisions. Now, underpinning the project of climate capitalism is an abiding faith in technology, including emissions reduction and carbon sequestration measures, and in market mechanisms. These are the two silver bullets, right? The market and technology will save us. And this is what fossil capital has largely embraced, even with some reluctance. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, really cool guy, his incoherent claim that building new tar sands pipelines will actually help fuel a market-based transition from carbon neatly exemplifies the contradictions of this project. This is what we're facing in Canada, this kind of new denialism. Approving the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline, which is certainly not a done deal at this point, as you may know, as part of Canada's climate plan. Let's build a new pipeline as part of our plan to reduce carbon emissions. Right? Similarly, Royal Dutch Shell, the Sky scenario that they released a few weeks ago in March cannot be squared with Shell's professed commitment to the 2015 Paris goals, which, by the way, were opposed by 94% of Shell shareholders last year. The actual shareholders of Shell voted 94% against implementing the Paris goals. And in a scathing critique of Shell's new scenario, this is what Oil Change International says. In summarizing the scenario itself, Oil Change International says, massive continuing reliance on fossil fuels, rapid growth in the use of hydrogen fuel, changes in consumer mindsets and energy efficiency practices, net zero deforestation, a mere 10,000 new carbon capture and storage plants around the world, and global carbon pricing mechanisms to encourage CCS are hallmarks of Royal Dutch Shell's new scenario for keeping average global warming below 2 degrees between now and 2070. Nevertheless, climate capitalism is persuasive among the transnational capitalist class, the elites of the world, and many non-elites, certainly in the global north, and it's easy to see why. By torquing technology and markets in the direction of renewables, is basically what climate capitalism is trying to do. Climate capitalism promises to decarbonize the forces of production slowly enough to avoid stranding major assets while preserving the capital-labor relation. It's a scenario of what Gramsci would call passive revolution, change from above that leaves the economic nucleus of the historical bloc. Consumerism, automobility, communicative capitalism, neoliberalism, untouched. Unfortunately, none of the scenarios for climate capitalism has been able to reconcile the contradiction between capital's incessant need to expand and the ecosystem's need for homeostatic equilibrium. Fortunately, as Laurie Atkin points out, climate capitalism is not the only solution to global warming on offer. Indeed, humanity today is at what she calls a critical crossroads. She says one road leads in the direction of shallow decarbonization, intensifying climate change feedback effects, and worsening economic insecurity and political instability. This is the path of climate capitalism. Another road leads in the direction of deep decarbonization and shrinking opportunities for capital accumulation underpinned by new forms of democratic governance. We could call this ecological democracy. Unfortunately, the second road is currently no more than a narrowly, poorly signed path, while the first is a superhighway bedecked with neon and billboards. So that brings me to the end of this second part of our presentation. And it's 6 o'clock, so we have time for some discussion, questions. So I'll take questions again, and maybe I'll collect several questions and then try my best to respond. Michelle, you've got a question?
I do. So if I understood, okay, so there are 90 corporate majors, I think you said,
Yeah.
in this fossil capitalism. Are they the transnational capitalist class? Are they national? Because it seems like fossil capitalism would lend itself to transnational, especially the oil and all of that.
Transnational or national? Okay. I got that, and I will respond, but I'll see if there's, are there other questions, points people want to raise?
Just on sort of green capitalism, I mean, increasingly, climate shocks are beginning to register. We had all the wildfires in the US, the hurricanes, we have a big drought. I mean, and I don't want to hinge politics on this, but climate determinism is also going to blow holes in green capitalism as it unfolds. And so it's really not going to stick at one level. On the other hand, of course, if we just go with climate determinism, we're all going to die. If that's going to solve the problem. It raises the question of agency and the strength of the counter-narrative, the counter-hegemonic project. And I'm sure we're going to be discussing that over the next few days. But, I mean, you've alluded to Atkin and some of the kind of horizon of new thinking and so on. I don't know if you want to say a bit more.
Can I ask something linked to that? Does this also then challenge Marx's understanding of class struggle? Because you said that Marxist insights, but Marx's understanding of class struggle was really about classes and contradiction. And where agency is coming from now isn't necessarily about a class contradiction, unless you see the ecological crisis as part of that contradiction.
Okay. And is there a third question? Yes.
Yeah, on the issue of fossil capital and climate change, what I would like to know is that there is a technology product. I think over the past few years, they designed a catalyst. It's called photocatalyst or catalytic converter. Does it have any effect in reducing maybe emissions also?
I'm sorry.
Catalytic converters, if they have a role, if they reduce emissions, like this is part of the green capitalism, I think.
Yes.
If catalytic converters really do reduce emissions, that's a green capital response.
How effective it is
Okay. As a technological issue, and I have to say I don't know a lot about catalytic converters, so I'm going to have difficulty answering that, but I might pivot to a different technology. Would be one way to try to deal with it. Okay, the 90 carbon majors are, I mean, basically, if you look at the global economy, oil, and you trace out the commodity chains, right? Petroleum and petroleum products circulate in the global economy on an international scale, right? So these carbon majors, at this point in time, certainly, if we took it back to a much earlier point in time, they would have been more nationally, focused in national markets, and to some extent, national markets certainly still exist. And there's regional, as I say, regionalization is a really important aspect of the global system. We need to concretize what we mean by the transnational, and not simply treat it as an abstraction, that has no grounding in material practices. But these carbon majors, certainly the biggest ones like BP and Shell and so on, Chevron, are giant transnational corporations. I mean, there's certainly players in transnational capitalism, and I think they're sort of key members of the transnational capitalist class. But probably if we looked down the list, the further down we go, the more nationally grounded these entities would be. If I have the list with me, I could probably cite some examples of that. So again, the division between the national and the transnational is, I think, a complicated one, because generally speaking, practices are always, to some extent, local and, in a sense, within a national context, even if they're, relationally speaking, also transnational practices. So, I think we need to think dialectically about the national and transnational, and not necessarily think of them as mutually exclusive categories. That this is a national, and we can compartmentalize all of the national over here, and the transnational is what's left over, or vice versa. So maybe that's a bit of a hedging answer, but that's what I would say. I don't know if that helps, but in terms of green capitalism and climate crisis, and I think it's true, Vish, that the climate crisis is deepening quickly, and the symptoms of that are increasingly visible to people in terms of extreme events and even the threat to human livelihood and capital accumulation itself in different places in terms of extreme weather. Is green capitalism equal to the task? No. Green capitalism cannot solve, this is the point I'm making, it cannot solve the climate crisis. Green capitalism will continue the whole self-expansive logic of capital. Even if there is a technology of carbon capture and storage that works to some extent, it's hard to see how green capitalism could really intervene on a scale to actually solve the climate crisis. So I think this is a really urgent crisis, and we will, in our later sessions, talk more about counter-hegemony and class formation from below. But for now, I would say that the crisis is reaching a point of, we're close to what people call tipping points. We're within years of triggering major positive feedback cycles. There's already evidence of this happening, right, in terms of the thawing of Arctic tundra, and methane release. That's an important one in terms of ocean acidification, very important positive feedback mechanism in the Earth system. So we're already in the middle of the climate crisis. We're not really at, it's going to happen 10 years from now kind of stage. We're at what John Bellamy Foster calls the oh shit moment. Right? That's where we are. So this is the whole notion of urgency is in my view very strong. But I think there's perhaps one scenario of green capitalism that I think is a possibility that we need to address and think about politically, and that is geoengineering, and in particular engineering the atmosphere itself to prevent the same amount of sun rays from getting to the surface of the Earth. I think that as the climate crisis deepens, there will be some technocratic and technological arguments made for that, because I think that's probably capital's only way of continuing the party, at this point in time. But that's just my take on it. In terms of the question of ecological crisis and the contradictions of capitalism, that's definitely a very complicated one. I said at the outset that the struggle for climate justice is at the cutting edge of transnational class formation from below. And I do think that is the case. But in order to make that point, one would have to reconceptualize what we mean by labor. Right? So I'm reaching for a different conception of labor, frankly. And I think we need a broader, more integral conception of what labor is. Labor should not be reduced to trade unionism, for example. Trade unionism is an important mechanism of class struggle, of resistance, and of workers protecting their livelihoods under capitalism. It's not a transformative political project, trade unionism. We need to go beyond that conception of what labor is, into, perhaps more of a notion of meta-labor as labor that involves, human agency in all of our relationships with the rest of nature. That's really what labor involves. And so when people are mobilizing around climate justice issues, they are mobilizing around labor issues, even if they don't recognize it as such. And I think we need a broad conception of labor and a broad conception of class struggle at this point in history to recognize that the struggle against capital is still a struggle of labor. There is still this antithesis of capital and labor, in my view, and it is reflected in the ecological crisis itself. In terms of catalytic converters, as I say, I don't really know much about that as a technology, but I would say that one of the real silver bullet technologies that is talked about at this point is, Musk and Tesla and battery storage, right? Like the question of being able to store electrical energy, some people see as a real game changer that will be very important in any post-carbon capital future. This kind of, to have solar power, wind power, geothermal power that can be effectively stored and generated locally and stored locally for local purposes. So we get away from these massive infrastructure projects of, whether hydroelectric dams or giant electric grids. There's actually now, the forces of production have developed to the point where battery power storage is on the horizon. However, how are these batteries produced? What is the labor involved? What's the ecology of battery production? That's an important question that we need to look into whenever we look at any new technologies as possible solutions. Whether catalytic converters, and you probably know more about catalytic converters than I do, because I can't say that I can answer your question. But perhaps that is of some relevance. Now we have a little bit more time before JP launches into his presentation. So if there is any other question, I'll take it up. Otherwise, I'll...
Yeah, you maybe take one or two other questions.
Okay. So why don't you launch into it? Yeah.
I think it's very interesting. This could be one of the linchpins for South Africa to understand the demand for platinum which has been in catalytic converters, but especially in Volkswagen and other car companies' diesel engines, which are very, very low in emissions, according to the car companies, until they were caught. And it's a very interesting moment where the market is driving change, and where we're getting something like a South African platinum industry, 85% of the world's platinum, a high increase to over $2,000 an ounce. Now we're about $950 or whatever it is today, after that 2015 crash, largely because of Volkswagen, also general prices. But I don't know, it's maybe one of the things you could be doing here is to connect transnational corporate demand for platinum, the single most valuable mineral we have right now. Far more platinum in the ground than gold. Potential of a platinum cartel like an OPEC, if we get together with Zimbabwe and Russia, to put 98% of the world's platinum under a cartel. Except that now palladium is taking its place for batteries, for electric cars, because the diesel engines are not low emissions. That was a fake. It was a market scam for profits. Fascinating little case that welcomes you to spend more time here and thinking about our particular angle.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I look forward to learning more about that. That's interesting. And the 85% figure in terms of the world market for platinum being contained in South Africa.
At one point valued at over $2 trillion, and mostly in the belt where Marikana massacre occurred.
Yep.
Where workers are paid $1,000 a month if they're working really hard to get, and stretching up to the public. So it's a very important microcosm. It's the fastest growing urban site in Africa as well. And chock full of reverse conflicts. The glory of the president who was supposed to build 5,500 houses for those platinum workers, he only built 3. The money ends up in Bermuda. And he emails in the request for a massacre when they go on a wildcat strike. So it's a fantastic moment of contradictions, which is partly driven by a global demand for platinum based on the false presumption that this is good for the environment.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll hand things over to JP.
Yeah, just to pick up where you left, maybe just a quick comment on this discussion about clean cars. One thing we need to remember is that the emissions due to car use are 40% due to the emissions, tailpipe emissions, and 60% is due to making the cars. So even if you have zero emission cars, electric cars and whatnot, you still reduce by only 40% the emissions due to that. So the conversation is a little bit broader than just batteries and electric and catalytic converter as well. So I'll just pick up here and just delve a little more fully into climate capitalism. So describe that type of strategies in more details that have been proposed by certain sections of the transnational capitalist class. And look at how transnational corporations organize politically in the face of climate change, have been organizing since the early 90s. And the main argument I'll be doing here, based a little more on the empirical material this time, is that there's that section of the global corporate community that comes together around that project of climate capitalism. And I look into it to see how they're connected, how close they are to whether they're very different or not than the fossil capitalist section. So I'll start by explaining what climate capitalism is about, picking up where Bill left, and then discuss a little bit how it relates to the transnational capitalist class, and then look at the climate capitalist policy planning network in more detail. So we'll have some more of the fun network graphs here. So broadly understood, climate capitalism, as Bill said, refers to a whole set of neoliberal climate policies to address climate change and make it into a source of corporate profits. It's always presented as a win-win situation. Corporations make money, the environment is protected, and everybody's supposed to be happy. And there's some specific policy instruments that are part of that package, of that project. So first of all, there's lots of strongly supports subsidizing improvements in energy efficiency. That's not very controversial. But the whole project relies a lot on carbon markets, so where allowances to emit a certain quantity of carbon dioxide and other gases can be traded. And associated, there's the whole thing about carbon offsetting mechanisms that bring funding to projects to avoid emissions. And now, which is becoming more popular in the last few years, the idea of carbon taxes, so setting directly a price on carbon, so as to foster innovation by companies who want to avoid these taxes. And there's also a whole set of voluntary measures, so voluntary carbon markets, where companies can buy carbon offsets to become carbon neutral, to put a little carbon neutral label on their products, and so on. So I'll take some of these in turn in more details here. So first of all, carbon markets, I don't think it's pretty well known by now, so I don't think I need to go too much into details, but just the way it works, basically governments decide on a cap on emissions, supposedly determined by climate scientists, and they allocate a number of allowances, permits equivalent to that cap that can be traded among the entities that are part of the market. And the cap is supposed to be reduced each year so that total emissions gradually decrease. So schemes like that have been broadly adopted now in many different countries. The EU has been one of the longest running ones, but the UK has one, Australia, New Zealand, the California, Quebec market is going to include Ontario next year, I think. Alberta in Canada has its own carbon market. There's something going on northeast in the US. China has a bunch of pilots in different cities, and so on. And globally, carbon markets are institutionalized first within the Kyoto Protocol and then the Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement. Of course, there's huge literature, including many contributions by Patrick, that show that carbon markets are very problematic. So just a few main problems with these markets. They don't work. The prices are too low to change behaviors, basically. So prices that would change behaviors are calculated to be, according to different estimations, anywhere between $50 US and $200 US. So that would be about 500 to 2,000 Rand per ton of carbon. The current prices in the European Union are about $15 a ton. In China, depending on the city, it ranges from 33 cents to 760 US dollars. California is around 15 now, and all of them have been increasing in the last year. Last year, they were around $10 in California. So that there's still a huge gap to what would be needed to change behaviors. And the other main problem is that these markets trade in abstract carbon. So they pretend it wouldn't matter. It doesn't matter where emissions are reduced. That's the whole idea, that be reduced wherever it's the cheaper to reduce them. But actually, place does matter. Where you reduce emissions, how you reduce them matters a lot. And so, for example, if you convert to natural gas, which is supposed to produce less greenhouse gas emissions than oil or coal, then you build a whole new infrastructure. You're locked in for 40, 50 years using natural gas. That still produces a whole bunch of emissions. So you can't really abstract carbon emissions in that way. Closely tied to carbon markets are carbon offsets. So in this case, companies or governments can finance projects elsewhere outside of the market in exchange for credits that can then be traded on the market. And that's been embedded in what's been called the Clean Development Mechanism. So under the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement has prolonged that mechanism. There's a very complex accounting mechanisms that are used to calculate how much emissions would be avoided by a specific project. So we're very much in the conditional here. We don't know what emissions would have existed without that project, so it's very hard to calculate the potential emissions reduction, but that's what carbon offsets are based on. So obviously there's a lot of space for fraud, for creative accounting, and so on. And another problem that's been more generally posed by Larry Lohman is that these carbon offsetting and carbon markets create ignorance among the public, especially. If you go into these accounting mechanisms, you count molecules, and you get busy with the very technical aspects, and you forget, you bracket out the political processes that are behind that prevent emission reductions from happening in the real world. And there's been lots of good studies as well on carbon colonialism. So these schemes allow, in general, large companies in the north to keep polluting by investing in projects in the south. And these leads to massive land grabs, mass evictions, lots of ecosystem destruction. For example, for large hydro dams that inundate vast areas, land grabs to plant forests to reap carbon credits. People tend to plant trees that grow fast because they get more credits in that way. So they end up replacing places where people farm with eucalyptus forests, monoculture forests, for example, and so on. So that's just a few examples of the consequences of climate capitalist policies that have been institutionalized. As I said, carbon taxes are more recent, well, not more recent, they've come back on the radar more recently. They were very much in discussions in the lead up to the Kyoto Protocol, and to please the US, they've been left aside in favor of carbon markets, so that the US would sign on to the Kyoto Protocol. And now that the US are out anyways, there's more discussions in many jurisdictions and globally about carbon taxes. Carbon taxes are a little bit they have more potential to reduce emissions because in that case governments decide specifically on what price they're going to put on carbon. So they can decide to put the price that would lead people and companies to change their behaviors. For example, Sweden's carbon tax is now at 120 euros, so 150 US dollars approximately. And their emissions have gone down 26% from the 1990 levels when the tax was first implemented. It's very hard to tell if there's a direct cause and effect relationship, but they seem to have done something to reduce emissions substantially. However, generally, the model of carbon tax that's being promoted is more of a compromise model. So they make the taxes that are implemented are in the range of $10 to $40 per ton, so not quite what could lead changes in behaviors. And the taxes are passed as revenue neutral taxes, quote unquote. So what that means is that governments implement a carbon tax, but in exchange for the support of certain constituencies, certain business constituencies, they reduce corporate taxes so that government revenues stay the same in the good old neoliberal mind frame. And so in the end, consumers are taxed at a rate that's low enough not to change behaviors too much. And for companies, the higher expenses that they face because of the tax when paying for their inputs is recovered in tax cuts. So in the end, it's the way carbon taxes have been implemented, including BC and many other places, is more switching taxation around. So these are the main policies that make up what we can call the climate capitalist project. You can call it like that in opposition to policies that would, for example, impose fines on companies and prevent them from doing more business if they don't respect environmental and climate limits. That would be a different, much more command and control strategy. That's not compatible with the neoliberal project, however. So it's all about pricing carbon nature in general, very much in line with neoliberalism and its philosophy. So large corporations in that broad philosophy, large corporations should play the main role in addressing climate change, and markets work better than governmental regulations. So governments have for only role to subsidize companies so that they can adopt these policies and join in carbon markets and so on. And in that mind frame, of course, people and ecosystems are just to be managed from above and are not allowed much agency at all. So I use this diagram to capture broadly the field of forces that are part of the climate struggle. So there's this line of fracture that's been identified in literature for the last couple of decades between fossil capitalism on the one hand and a climate capitalist project that would be in opposition to it. So in the late 80s, early 90s, in the run-up to the 1992 Rio Summit on Sustainable Development, there's a group of companies and capitalists that decided to pursue a different strategy from denial. So they got together around the Rio Summit and they started organizing around that idea of green capitalism, climate capitalism as a part of it. And so instead of denying the reality of climate change, they decided to accept it, and this allowed them to take the lead into making policies to address it. So that was a very strategic move, so it allowed them to portray themselves as the environmentally enlightened vanguard of capitalists. And that helped them to get leverage in the political arena, to get public support from certain NGOs, and so on. And so they managed to forge that kind of compromise between, on the one hand, hardcore deniers who didn't want to address the issue, and on the other hand, the large-scale rapid transformations that were demanded by climate activists, by climate scientists, on the other hand. So this is what climate capitalism as a project is about. It's about that compromise position. It's about the corporate community taking over, taking control of climate policy making globally and at national level as well in different countries. So climate capitalism as a political project, it's opposed in many ways to fossil capitalism. So just a few words about what a political project is, to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. Well, the way I see it is as that ensemble of discourses, narratives, as well as policy proposals that are put forth by politically engaged, politically involved groups. So that's very important. It's not only in the discursive sphere, it's not just ideas, it's very practical policy proposals like what I've described, carbon markets, taxes, and so on. And that together propose a vision for how social and economic relations should be organized and transformed. And following Gramsci, a political project becomes hegemonic when a critical mass of social constituencies rally behind that project, so that those in position of power who support it can then legitimately enact the policy proposals that are part of the project, and at some point that even eventually become common sense. Political projects like that, like climate capitalism, green capitalism, don't come out of nothing. They're organized by people and groups in function of specific worldviews and interests. And so from the perspective of transnational class analysis, the question is whether climate and fossil capitalism represent two different fractions of the capitalist class with different opposing economic interests. So the old fossil economy, fossil fuel companies, oil and gas, car companies, versus the new renewable energy, electric cars, high-tech economy. Or the other option is that it's only a matter of strategic assessment on how it's best to work to capture climate politics. So in the rest of that time, I'll present some research I've been doing that looks at this question. Let's skip on that. So what I did for that research, I selected a list of environmental or climate policy planning groups. So these are all organizations that operate globally, so that try to enact policy change at the global level. and that are either identified the climate capitalist groups, so they're really just focused on climate change, or green capitalist groups that are broadly focused on green capitalism with climate as one of their policy fields. So what these groups do, they have a twofold action. They do outreach work mainly towards politicians, also the media, the broad public. They organize conferences, other events where corporate heads meet with high-level politicians, media representatives, and so on. And they publish reports, economic analysis that make a case for climate capitalism that can be picked up by the media as well. And on the other hand, the boards also provide places for corporate executives to meet together and discuss corporate strategy specifically in relation to climate capitalism and climate change and how to address it politically. So they work to produce these reports, these case studies of companies that adopted carbon markets, of corporations that have increased their profits by adopting more efficient production technologies, and so on. So broadly, they're in the business of producing and mobilizing knowledge about how to address climate change in a way that's coherent with the neoliberal regime and its tendency, as I said, towards low regulation and, on the other hand, continued corporate profits in the short and longer term. So they're part of the main organizations that create and construct that climate capitalist project. So that's why I think it's quite interesting to focus on them to understand critically what they're about, what the project is about. Just a few examples more specifically. So the IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association, that's the largest organization dedicated to promoting carbon markets globally. Each year they produce a report on the state of carbon markets that's used by investors and others and traders. And they also put together training tools for executives to understand the basics of carbon markets, how they work, how they can get their companies to adhere, and so on. The World Business Council on Sustainable Development that Bill mentioned, that's a group of CEOs and chairs from the largest companies in the world that advanced the business concept of sustainable development by different means. It was created in '92, just after the Rio Summit, under the aegis of the International Chamber of Commerce and the Rio Summit Secretariat. And they have affiliates in different regions of the world so that they can act as regional headquarters. Third example, the UN Global Compact. This one was created by the International Chamber of Commerce as well, together with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, with support from the United Nations. And they address more broadly issues of corporate social responsibility. And they produce global codes of conduct for member companies that can adhere voluntarily to these codes of conduct. And so what I'm interested in is looking at this policy planning network. So look at how much cohesion there is among the corporate community around these organizations promoting climate capitalism. So who steers them? How important are the companies who are on their boards? What sectors they're from? Where they're based? And so on. And so what I do is I look at the board level connections between policy groups and corporations to see where the groups fit in the intercorporate network. So the first analysis I'll present here looks at these policy groups within the 500 largest companies in the world. So if climate capitalism was a marginal project, what I would expect to find is, so in blue you have the corporations, 500 largest corporations. In red you'd have where I would find the policy groups if climate capitalism was a disorganized project that does not connect to the major companies. If it were the case, then we could safely ignore the project and just focus on fossil capitalism because it probably wouldn't go anywhere. But instead, what I'm finding is that the policy groups appear quite close to the central positions in that network. And so because many of the groups occupy central positions, they connect to other important central companies. They're able to influence and mediate relationships within that network structure. So that means that they wield certain power in the field, and they have the capacity to bring companies to adhere to climate capitalism as a strategy in the face of climate change. There's many ways to measure how central groups are. That's just one measure called power centrality. It's just to show that many of the groups are in the top 100 positions. Here's also the top 100 most central of these of this network. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development comes up first, and the UN Global Compact is not far behind. So that means that structurally, these two organizations have a great deal of power because they connect to major corporations. Some groups are disconnected from the network, so it's not all of them that are that powerful, but it's important to note that many of them really are, so that there is a case to say that there's a lot of interest among the global corporate community into climate capitalism. Another way to look at it is to look at what firms are on the board of these groups. So they're shown in the orange on this graph. So all the orange dots there are directly connected to one or the other policy group in red. And so I find that policy groups do link to more central firms. That means that more central firms are present on policy boards, the less central firms are not in general. So that means that they put in the resources to send people to these organizations. Usually they send top executives on one or more of these groups, and so that they have an interest in participating in these groups. And so I assume in promoting or having some say in steering the project of climate capitalism. So I take the fact that the policy group embedded so close to the core to mean that climate capitalism does get traction at the heart of the global corporate community. This next graph here shows the entire policy planning network. So all the companies that are on the policy group's board, not just Global 500. So that's called egocentric network. So you have the policy groups and everybody who connects to them and the links in between them. And we see here it's organized in what we call a core periphery structure. So you have a dense core of connections in the middle, and at the outskirts, nodes that are more or less, that are not very much connected together, but that still connect to the core. You can isolate the core region here. And so that structure means that there is that group of corporations and policy groups here that form that cohesive network around climate capitalist policy groups, so that are interested, once again, in furthering that project. And I insist on this because the question of social cohesion is very important. The more cohesive the network is, the greater the potential for corporate and policy group directors to align their interests, to construct a cohesive discourse, and present a unified position in the face of politicians and climate negotiators. And so their lobbying becomes much more effective when they're cohesive. So it's very significant to find that cohesive group around climate policy groups. The conclusion would be very different if I had found something like that, that's more small clusters that would be disconnected. Then, once again, I would think that we shouldn't pay too much attention to these groups and their project. But because we find that densely connected network, it means, once again, that's something we need to pay attention to. Something's going on. So that's the more peripheral groups. And this is the same network. The first one was 2010. This is 2016. So we find, again, the same structure. Here it's important to look if that group, the cohesion is stable in time. If that group keeps cohesive, or if they just came together around the Copenhagen Summit and then dispersed. So then we find that around the time of the Paris Agreement, there's still a cohesive core in the middle of the network. And if we isolate it here, it even appears to be denser, and there's actually more connections and more companies in the 2016 network slightly. So we can say that the network is stable. Now to just finish up, I'll look a little bit into more details as to what these companies are who are on these policy boards. So that's the regional distribution. We see it's very much skewed towards core countries of the north. Japanese companies are out a little bit. And countries from the south have been joining a little bit, but they're still pretty marginal in that network. If we look at the economic sectors, quite interestingly here, energy companies from the majority of the sector, almost these companies, almost a quarter in 2010, down a little bit to 1/5 in 2016. And manufacturing companies, fossil fuel dependent manufacturing, and financial corporations are there as well. If we break down the table more finely to just look at the energy sector, which includes renewable and non-renewable, here what we find is that actually the fossil fuel sector, fossil fuel and nuclear, here on the non-renewable, form a large part of the network here. Although their part's been shrinking quite a bit in the last 6 years, well, between 2010 and 2015. There's a small number of biofuel and biogas companies that appeared, and the small number of renewable energy companies has gotten even smaller in 2016. So if we go back to this picture and to sum it up, the structure of the network hasn't changed substantially over the period. Some groups and companies are more central than others, and so more central to the project. And renewable energy firms are absolutely marginal in the network. And if we look into more details about the actual companies that form the network, so first of all, the energy companies, if you can all see, you have Saudi Aramco, Total, Engie, the two French companies, Statoil, the Norwegian company, Shell, RWE, German coal company, Rio Tinto, active in coal mining as well. Then the manufacturing firms, you have Volkswagen, BMW, Siemens, LafargeHolcim, the cement company, General Electric, all the way to the left, and so on. So very large fossil fuel-dependent companies here. And financial firms, you've got Bank of America at the top, Munich Re, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Standard Chartered, La Caixa, that's a large credit union based in Barcelona. And finally, the renewable energy companies. They're here, down here at the bottom, Ritter Energy and Solar Fabric, and that's two companies headed by the same person. And I don't know if you have that here, but in Canada we have the Ritter chocolate bars that are also associated with these two companies founded by Mr. Alfred Ritter, who's a member of the club program. So renewable energy is all but absent from the core. Mostly we find very large corporations based in Europe, very much involved in fossil fuel extraction and fossil fuel-based manufacturing. So here we don't have a case where you have a different set of companies who propose different model, who rally together in opposition to the old fossil fuel and car company capitalist fraction. These don't appear to be two opposing fractions of capital. So my interpretation here is that in reality, the fossil capitalism, climate capitalism opposition is really just a tactical divergences within the dominant transnational capitalist class. Instead, in opposition to the common sense discourse that says that renewable and high-tech companies are seen as the eco-modernizers par excellence, and the most likely contender to lead a new dematerialized regime of capitalism. So I think I'll leave it there. So we have a few minutes for questions, and so yeah.
Thanks. It's very fascinating. I just want to clarify, and maybe you said it, but I didn't hear it. Initially, you had a distinction between climate capitalists and green capitalists. So can you, and then you can come back to the green capitalists. I just want to more clarity on that. But the other one is looking at that picture of the global 500 and the extent to which they are invested in the climate capitalist network and presumably green capitalist network. a majority of them seem to come from Europe, but still a substantial amount from North America. Now, so you have that major manifestation of a shift from fossil capital, even if it's a rhetorical shift or a greenwashing shift. And then you have the Trump agenda, which directly opposes that and is dismantling, as far as we can see, unless that's just clownish behavior. But I don't think so. So who does he represent? Which fraction of capital is behind that Trump agenda?
That's a great question. Maybe I'll take a couple others. Yes, Michelle? Yeah.
I think it actually might build on Devin's last question. And first, thanks. It's amazing data, quite frightening actually. But one of the questions that I get why corporations would want to be part of these policy groups, and I get why they've established this architecture to push a particular project. But do you have any data on the efficacy of this? I mean, what is the relationship to states? Are they actually influencing policy, or are we just saying we have neoliberalism and we see the effects of all of this, so we know it's happening? But is there actually the same kind of data that you've shown, these relations to, I'm learning new language, carbon majors and central, you call it something, the central firm, I forget what they call it, central corporation or something,
Yeah.
your central,
Central.
right, and you showed that the carbon majors in your central are overlapping. Do you have same data, same kind of, is there data that can show these same kind of networks and overlapping kind of intricate relations with states? And that kind of leads back to the Trump question, because Trump, I mean, we assume that governments are actually behind this, but Trump is actually showing he's not. So I mean he's got a horrible example for like standing up against this, but it begs a deeper question of the relationship to states.
Great questions. Yeah.
And thanks, it was very interesting. Yeah, I wanted to know that the fossil fuel capitalism historically predates this emergence of the transnational class. So how has this new class changed the project or the functioning of fossil capitalism? Because as you were saying, climate capitalism, and I agree with you, it's just, some sort of a reconfiguration of old extractive practices and, just giving it a different, more presentable name. So how has that basically the nature of capitalism around energy change with this new transnational class?
Good question. Well, I'll just take them in order. So first of all, you were asking me the green climate capitalism distinction. The distinction is that green capitalism contains climate capitalism, I think, which are all part of the broad neoliberal project. So it's basically, I don't know, I would interpret it as the neoliberal way to address climate change and environmental problems in general. And then about the G500, the EU, North America, and Trump. Well, my interpretation is that we don't have class fractions opposing each other here. So it's not a neoliberal fraction versus another fraction, or national versus transnational fraction. I don't think we can see that in that fossil versus green capitalism debates. So where Trump fits into that, well, he's adopted the other strategic option of supporting fossil capital, I think. And that's very much related to US politics. He's got his base to please in the US, and so he needs to, he supports fossil fuel development pipelines, and at the same time he gets sympathy from his constituents by bashing protesters. So Trump is he's of the fossil capitalist persuasion, but I'm not too sure if that's a good answer, but I don't know where to place him in terms of class fractions. Bill would probably have more of an answer than me as to that. Rochelle, you were asking about the efficacy and the relationship to the state. That would be very interesting to have data on that. I didn't collect that, and that would be more complicated just because states are more complex organizations. You have corporation, you have the board of directors, you can list the names. You have the other corporation, you list the names, and you see if there's overlap. Pretty simple, even though it's pretty time consuming to get all the data together. With states, how do you, what do you determine that are the relationships in that sense? So you can't really fit states within the same analysis.
I suppose you could with the US because there's been a lot of examples of the board.
Well, you can
Right.
look at the revolving door,
Or policy.
but it's hard to get systematic information
Yeah.
on this. So the influence, well, what we know about these policy groups is that they're present at the climate summits. For example, they lobby directly national governments and their delegations at climate summits. They lobby national governments throughout the year. They lobby UN officials. And so you could go through lobbying registries that could be a possible source of data, but if you work transnationally, it's not all countries that have lobbyist registries, so that would be a bit tricky as to that, unfortunately. And you had a question, you were asking how climate capitalism changes fossil fuel capital, is that the gist of your question?
No, I asked basically how the transnational capitalist classes change the face or the nature of fossil fuel capitalism, given that fossil fuel capitalism predates the emergence of this new class.
Well, I think historically, Bill might want to chime in on that, but I think historically, as fossil capitalism developed and oil replaced coal as the main source of energy, the electricity, the transnational capitalist class built itself at that time as well. So it's very much tied to fossil capitalism in that sense. The most important, the biggest companies in the world are oil companies still, and they're very much multinational companies. They have operations in all countries, or almost all countries in the world. They sell their products in all countries, so they're very, very transnationalized in that sense. And how does climate capitalism fit into that? Well, once again, so analysts started talking about that split within the opposition to climate policy when BP and Shell broke out of the climate lobby groups in the late 80s, early 90s. And was that, or was it the mid 90s? Maybe I get it wrong. In any case, they broke out at that point. Whereas Exxon and Chevron then and a few others kept with the denialist discourse and strategy. So in terms of transnational capitalist class, you have two groups of transnational companies that try two different strategies. And it was probably not wanted that way, but the effect of that is that the public and politicians got confused, got different messages as to what they wanted. And I think it had an effect of paralyzing action in a way, because they didn't know which way to go, which policies to enact, so they ended up leaving out the carbon tax from Kyoto, for example, and putting in carbon markets, which are much less efficient policy. For example, so there's been that tension between the two in climate policy since then. And yeah, does that respond? Kind of. Yeah, I don't know. Going around a bit.
No, thanks.
Yeah, welcome. Yes, Richard?
I think, Fish, do you want to follow up immediately? I'd like to question methodology also. I'm very interested in this proximity mapping, but I would say at first blush it seems to me you have two problems. One is that I don't see the gravity of the corporates aside from the numbers of board director interlocks. I don't see the weight of the strength of those relationships. And maybe most importantly, you won't maybe believe it from my mouth, but I think you have got a big data fetish which puts more emphasis on these interlocks than on the individuals. Now, Marx said that individuals can be bearers of class interests. So if we wanted to say who's making fossil capital, it would be Trump on the way to perhaps Al Gore as a climate capitalist, and somewhere in there is a Rex Tillerson. These individuals are terribly important. I would guess you'd agree that if you don't have a Mark Moody Stewart at the confluence of an ABB and an Anglo and the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, or if you don't have a Schmidheiny doing some of the theory, or Pavel Suklov from Deutsche Bank, you don't really have very thick and charismatic leadership. And therefore, you could have lots of networks, but where are they going? Similarly, on the climate justice, what I'm missing is climate action. I'm missing a Bill McKibben, Kumi Naidu, both of whom are okay with climate capitalism up to a point. Obviously some contestation around divestment. But I certainly don't see the distinction between a climate action and a climate justice. And I say in climate justice, I'm thinking again individuals like Naomi Klein or Hina in Africa, Bobby Pete, Des Dessau here in South Africa. And I'm just wondering if it's maybe more useful to find not simply linkages on a numeric basis of directors, maybe the weightiness of the companies and their assets or their business, but something more nuanced in which the role of leadership and charismatic individuals would come through. That means for you, I think, Bill, I'd be so interested if from David Rockefeller to Klaus Schwab to who's our Southern Bloc leaders we'll find in late July? Who's head of the BRICS Business Council? You all know his name, right? And don't say Brian Molefi, because he used to be the head of the BRICS Business Council. The new leader is, comrades aren't watching carefully, but his name is Iqbal Survey. And he's the greatest joke, I think, in business in South Africa.
It was my comrade in the student movement.
So Iqbal Survey plus Transnet is the BRICS Business Council. And I think with the total lack of leadership, you're absolutely right, Bill, to say BRICS is really incoherent. It's a joke. But it seems to me that's what might be fun to overlap again, which is individual charisma. Saying that as a dogmatic, vulgar Marxist, I hope you can take that seriously.
Yes,
Just 2 points. I mean, I'm not convinced that climate capitalism can reproduce itself as a hegemonic project, both in the interstate system and in the kind of center-periphery divide. I mean, I just think that there's so you got the crisis in neoliberalism and inequalities. I mean, we've been declared the most unequal in terms of income recently, ironically, by the World Bank. And you've got the costs and so on escalating with climate shocks. I mean, we haven't priced our drought, but it's big numbers for what's happened in other parts of the world and so on. And I think that's going to place a whole set of stresses and constraints on policy making and decisions and so on and so on. And I don't think it's going to be a neat diffusion, if you like. I think that's what I'm getting at. I think there's a lot going against it as a class project, besides its internal contradiction. But the second point is this: is that when you look at it on its own terms, it's not going to solve the problem. We know that, and on the other hand, we can see that in the shadows, I mean, fossil capital is still reproducing itself, and it's reaching for complex hydrocarbons. I'm not sure how much of investment is getting stranded and so on, but it's still in the game. But I really think we've got to change the narrative in the terms of the discourse. I mean, at one level, heuristically, this is powerful, and analytically, it helps us make those distinctions and maybe pick up some nuances around it and so on. But I do think that this adds up, for me anyway, as climate fascism. And really, when you start featuring in the role of the Pentagon and all of that, I mean, they're leading us over the cliff. They're leading us to doomsday, basically. Okay. So I really do think that we've got to start thinking about another category to think about this madness, because this is insane, basically.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Yeah, it's pretty insane. Yeah, very, very interesting comments. Thank you both. So Patrick, yes, data fetish. Yes, I did present a lot of data. there's a lot of political economy behind that, well, that's what I want to contribute is that data, because we know the political economy, you wrote about it, many other people wrote about it already, so I don't think there's I think it's interesting to present that data and look at what's happening on the ground. Now what you were saying about individuals is really interesting, because I'm just presenting the corporations here, but each line represents one or more person, more people who link two companies together. So I did look at the data with the individuals. And what you're saying is interesting because something I haven't explored yet between 2010 and 2016 is that the three main people of the network in 2010, Anne Lauvergeon from Riva in France, the Bank of America guy, what's his name, Charles Holiday, and Jim Rogers from Duke Energy. All three disappeared from the network. The two guys retired, and Lauvergeon was fired by the French government. And so I find a different network if I look at the individuals in 2016. There's still cohesion, apparently, but it's less tight at the center, at the core. Because these three people who made up most relationships at the core are not there anymore. So the network still exists, there's still people, but no super big heads like these people who were on 6 corporate boards and 3 policy groups who really held the network together. So it's very interesting to focus also on individuals. And with that data, you can do that. Of course, it's really useful and interesting to get into the biographies and what these people are actually doing and saying, and who's really leading the thing in terms of creating the discourse and being politically active. But I think it's pretty well captured in that kind of data because the people who are more active politically, more present in the media, are also the people who are on more directorships and who go to these policy groups. And so you see they have more connections in these data. So yeah, there's lots of connections to be made, and that could be enriched a lot with more specific discussions of specific cases, as you're saying. Totally agree with that, and I can't present everything, can't do everything. The data work is pretty time-consuming, unfortunately. And you were talking about climate justice, climate action. So in this case, I'm not sure how I would connect it directly. I was talking about corporate action, so corporate political activism. Of course, there's all the activism from below and all the struggles and contradictions and discussions and debates in the movement. But that's something Bill's going to talk about tomorrow and on Thursday.
Because sometimes I put a WWF, not in any kind of climate justice.
Yeah, exactly. That would be a fantastic project, and many people told me they were interested in doing that and looking at the corporate interlocks with the big NGOs.
Civilized society.
Yeah, and that would be a really interesting project to look at because these big NGOs have many corporate heads on their boards as well. So it's, if somebody wants to pick up the project here, I'm happy to share my data. Vish, you were saying you were dubious about the capacity of climate capitalism to reproduce itself in the context of the neoliberal, the crisis of neoliberalism. So I thought that's really interesting, because it's making me think that, so the literature on climate politics has really focused on that split within the corporate community. And my sense is here, I think it's not that much of a split. And even more recently, with all the recent developments, I think it's becoming much more murky again, and much less obvious. As Bill was saying, our dear Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau got elected on partly in the green agenda and is pushing pipelines at the same time, justifying them by saying that that's going to help the climate plan. Total contradiction, but he's kind of merging the two approaches together, so I don't know if we can separate them as much as we're doing with these two categories. We might have to revisit the categories, and also something I've been working on is looking at geoengineering politics, and the way it seems to be getting together has a kind of compromise politics between the hardcore deniers who can rally to geoengineering. Trump made comments on that. You had a few months ago, you had some commission looking at it. Bjorn Lomborg, the famous skeptical environmentalist, came out in support. Warren Buffett, I think. So some major name. Bill Gates is pouring lots of money into research. And at the same time, what climate capitalists, what we could label as climate capitalists, are saying is that, and even people in the climate justice movements, what they're seeing is that the Paris Agreement is directly leading towards geoengineering. The provisions of the IPCC that the 2 degrees Celsius target is based on include a large amount of assumed geoengineering, of assumed negative emissions. So the IPCC predictions that they present in the reports, their latest report 2014, assumes about half negative emissions technologies will account for about half the figures that they present in their scenarios. So this, without that, the scenarios would just be absurdly ridiculous, and yeah, I'm not sure why they're doing that, but that was a bit shocking when it came out in last January or February, I think. So that's very much what's coming next. That's where the discussion is at right now. So it goes much beyond these two supposedly opposite categories of fossil capitalism, climate capitalism. Yeah, so that's where debates should be moving to. Yeah, so thanks. Any